Is it water with the sheep in the box?
A few months ago, I made a video debunking common transphobic and TERF arguments, after a rather unfortunate experience during which an old school teacher outed herself as a TERF, and during that video I made the point that TERFs, and those who claim to be feminists whilst attacking and harming feminism, are sadly common in the UK, my home country in case you hadn't guessed from the accent, and they are, but TERFs are not the only ones, and in fact TERFs and their allies often have extremely toxic views outside of trans people as well. So let's talk about SWERFs, or sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, as well as anti-sex worker rhetoric in general, because I've come across far too many people recently, online and IRL, who claim to care about women's rights, but only if those women don't have a job they disapprove of, claim to care about sexual liberation, but not if it's used in ways they disagree with, and advocate against the tendency for our patriarchal system to control women's bodies, but also seek to control what women whose jobs they disagree with do with their bodies. Before we really get started, I feel that I should make a few of my biases clear up front, in the interest of honesty and clarity for those who aren't aware of my wider body of work, before I really get into debunking common SWERF arguments. 1. I am a leftist and as such mostly agree with the Marxist interpretation of work under capitalism, more on this later. 2. I am not, nor have I ever been, a sex worker. However, I do have many friends and comrades who either are or have been in the past, some of whom were kind enough to help fact check and proofread the script for this video before I started recording, just so I could be certain I wasn't misrepresenting anyone or anything. 3. I am an anarchist and therefore do not necessarily trust or believe in the power or authority of the state. However, I acknowledge that sometimes certain legislation, for example those surrounding workers' rights, can and do benefit people in the short term. 4. I do not believe that something being illegal makes it immoral or that it should remain illegal, as should probably be clear already based on the fact that I've previously made videos defending specific instances of political violence and shoplifting. 5. I'm what's called a sex-positive feminist and wholeheartedly believe that sex is not something we should be squeamish or weird about and certainly shouldn't shame people over. 6. I, unlike most SWERFs, am extremely aware that not all sex workers are cis women. However, usually these conversations are framed in a sort of but what about the women kind of way, mostly because SWERFs don't care about men or trans people, and conservatives think that they don't exist. So for the purposes of this video, I'll mostly also be sticking to this framework, though it isn't entirely accurate or representative of the sex industry in general. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about sex work, debunk the most common anti-sex work arguments, and potentially also dunk on some SWERFs along the way, shall we? They're usually not quite as bad or up their own arse as TERFs, but they are pretty bad, and honestly, there is a lot of overlap, because as it turns out, people who hate trans people for existing and living authentically as the people they are and want to oppress and harm them to protect women also want to oppress and harm other women who have a job they don't like to protect women, because that makes sense. Right, let's get this one out of the way first, because it's the most fundamental pillar and most common argument in my experience. This idea that sex workers, unlike literally any other worker, sell their bodies for the pleasure of men, and that this is in some way exploitative and unacceptable, ignoring that a lot of sex workers are in fact men or trans people, because of course. Let's talk about capitalism, shall we? There's this common misconception when it comes to sex work, that sex work is uniquely exploitative, and honestly, this is an incredibly ignorant, centrist, liberal take that nobody who understands how capitalism works should take seriously. You see, when people like me say things like sex work is work, we don't just mean you should respect sex workers, though of course you should, but that quite straightforwardly, from an objective standpoint, sex work is really no different from any other kind of work under capitalism, and that we should decriminalise and regulate the industry in the same way we do, for example, the insurance industry. Sure, sex work can be exploitative or dangerous, probably more so than a lot of other work, but the reason for that isn't necessarily the fact that it's sex work, but at least partially because sex work is illegal in the first place. Well, actually in the UK it's technically not illegal to sell sex as an independent sex worker, but it is illegal to solicit sex, and it's also illegal to work with another sex worker for the sake of safety or to profit off the earnings of a sex worker, because that would then be a brothel. More on this in the next section. The point here is that sex work is indeed exploitative, and often relies on a power imbalance between a sex worker and a pimp or madam, or between a sex worker and a customer in many cases. Sex workers do indeed put their bodies on the line and risk their health for their work, and this is a concern, but the problem there is not specific to sex work, but to capitalism, and an unregulated niche that sex work fills. See, it can be true that sex work is exploitative, and also that this is just the reality of work under capitalism, though it should be acknowledged that most sex workers in the UK are independent. Let's break it down.
Whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house.
In many ways, this is the point of capitalism, really. I'm exploited by my boss on a daily basis, forced to perform menial, pointless work to generate profit for a multi-million-dollar corporation, and get compensated a minuscule amount of the value I produce for said employer, and if I want out of this arrangement, I have no choice but to either find other work, which will not be all that different, or find my own way in business. Sounds very much like the relationship between sex worker and pimp, right? Except the difference there is that the sex worker, despite being an employee, does not have the same rights and protections that, for example, I have if my employer decides to abuse me, specifically because sex work is illegal and therefore workers' and employment rights legislation cannot apply, and equally it is significantly harder, if not impossible, to unionize. Likewise, an independent sex worker who operates autonomously doesn't have the same rights or opportunities a small business owner in any other industry might have, because a lot of those options are simply not available to them.
Whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house.
We say that sex workers sell their body, but we don't seem all that willing to acknowledge that if this is the case, then surely that principle also applies to all workers, and especially manual labourers, who sell their bodies to a capitalist to generate profit simply in order to get by, or soldiers who, much like sex workers, directly sell their bodies to the state and risk death or injury for a steady paycheck to support family, pay bills, etc. Or how about mercenary groups like Blackwater, who sell their bodies to the highest bidder on an independent basis, just like most sex workers? Can you honestly say that a soldier who, if they refuse orders, can be severely punished, or any employee who must carry out instructions or risk destitution or even homelessness, puts their body at less risk than a sex worker? Precautions can be taken in sex work. Not all sex work involves actually having sex, and there are a lot of workarounds, but if you get shot in the head, there's not much that can be done for you. Do you know how many construction workers die in the line of duty each year? A fucking lot. And even taking this into consideration, construction workers and soldiers are covered by workers' rights legislation. You can't dock a bricklayer's pay for breaking equipment because they would sue you for that, but a pimp and or customer can dock or refuse to pay for basically any reason, and what recourse does a sex worker have? Even independent sex workers, who make up the majority incidentally, so the exploitation angle isn't quite what SWERFs imagine it is to begin with, should be covered by laws protecting small businesses, like for example some recourse if and when a customer decides to walk off without paying, a la Dine and Dash laws, ability to get small business loans and so on and so forth, but they're not, because their business is technically illegal. Oh, and when it comes to risking their health, let's not pretend that long-term health conditions and disease is unique to sex work. From minors struggling with breathing issues for the rest of their lives, to office workers whose sedentary profession often causes permanent back and posture issues, to farmers who risk a number of health problems arising from their interaction with and exposure to a whole range of biological factors which may cause a wide variety of diseases. Or how about the government that is literally killing people by COVID-19 by forcing them back to work and their kids back to school during a pandemic before making sure it's safe? The problem here is not with sex work specifically, it's with a society that illegalizes and stigmatizes it, meaning that sex workers don't have the protections they may require to function. In short, sex work is uniquely dangerous, but only because we allow it to be, and in many cases force it to be, just like a few other industries I could name, and legislation that exists specifically to help workers cannot apply to them because of the fact that sex work is illegal.
Whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house.
This is the favourite argument of the I just care about the women SWERFs you come across online, and it's important to acknowledge that yes, not everyone is in sex work because they love it. Some are forced into it for a number of reasons, be that drugs, inability to find work due to immigration status, or just plain old poverty. The thing is, not only is this basically the exact same as being forced into any other job to avoid poverty, the causes of these issues are rooted in deep systemic issues rather than anything to do with sex work. Like, needing money for drugs is a common common one, but the reason it's a problem in the first place is because of the drug war criminalizing addicts, meaning that there is no real help for those who want to get off drugs or kick their habit, and as such they become vulnerable and easy to exploit due to a lack of any kind of support that may help steer them away from self-destructive desperation. The same could be said of medical debt. If people are forced into sex work because they're poor, and medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the US, well, it seems to me like a universal healthcare system might help reduce the number of people with little choice but to enter sex work. Likewise, SWERFs will bring up trafficking, and yes, it is a problem, though nowhere near as common or as a proportion of sex workers as the media may like you to believe, but the reason it's a problem is because the people who get trafficked in are unable to escape due to being criminals by profession and police being abusive to sex workers and the threat of deportation. For some, especially refugees, even being a trafficked sex worker is preferable to being sent home. Maybe legalizing sex work and allowing undocumented immigrants to legally stay without repercussions might help reduce sex work. And of course, if sex worker was just like any other job, employers would be legally bound to do background checks, including immigration checks, on potential employees, which would of course mean that it would be much more difficult to traffic someone into the country for sex in that way. Because right now, the government is a second layer of coercion, forcing sex workers to remain sex workers by making any escape from their situations difficult, if not impossible, due to what essentially boils down to placing the values of moral conservatism over human lives as per fucking usual. Oh, and let's not forget that, due to the illegalization of paying for sex in the UK, clients can't report if a sex worker appears at risk or to have been trafficked either. But again, this is the problem with liberals, which SWERFs often are. They individualize systemic issues and fail to see the big picture a majority of the time. Sex work will always exist, but if you really care about protecting sex workers and making sure nobody is ever forced or coerced into sex work, you'd better start dismantling and reforming the systems and institutions at the root of these issues. In short, sex workers do not sell their body, they use their body to sell the service of sex, in the same way that a mechanic uses their body to sell the service of repairing vehicles. If sex workers sell their bodies for sex, then I sell my body for insurance. It might be more accurate to say that they sell their labour, but that's just what all workers have to do to survive under capitalism. Honestly, the only reason one would continue to push this line is quite simply that they have some rather patriarchal and, to be frank, pretty misogynistic views about sex and women's sexuality in specific. This is just classist bullshit, the same way liberals and conservatives alike will look down on and demonise the homeless and unemployed because they're lazy and get money for nothing, and likewise the bullshit around unskilled labour. The fact that it's about sex and is mostly about women absolutely has a part to play, and the fact that primarily sex workers are women using their sexuality to get ahead is scary for a lot of people, but this denigration of sex work as a profession because it's not real work is absolutely the same shit as claiming that disability claimants are lying to get free money, or that the homeless should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Turns out that they don't even mean those things, because going from homelessness to success due to sex work is usually not respected in the way you might hope it would be. Wrong bootstraps, I guess. I just wanted to take this opportunity to let you know that after that line in the script editor for this video, who I hired to make sure I didn't fuck anything up or make any factual errors, Twitch streamer and former sex worker Kezzbox, who you should go check out, wrote, "You could in fact say that they're pulling themselves up by their boob straps" in the script notes, and I felt that I needed to share that. Now obviously, the immediate retort to this is to point to people like landlords and politicians, people who get paid astronomical amounts of money to lounge around in the commons and occasionally cast a vote to make the lives of the poor and vulnerable worse, or landlords not doing any labour beyond occasionally calling a plumber and rake in money simply because they happen to own property, which is to my mind the definition of easy money and not real work, but for some reason it's always the poor that get accused of being lazy shirkers, not the rich. Weird that, I wonder why. But the fact is that unlike landlords, sex workers actually do work, so this argument makes literally zero sense. An OnlyFans model has to create the perfect image, keep their body in shape, edit the images, and so on and so forth, and there's a ton of labour that goes into making porn, for example, and like, do you not think that having sex for money is work? If not, what is work to you? Because honestly, a sex worker's job is a lot fucking harder than mine, and I'd be willing to bet yours too. Much like other so-called called unskilled labour, we as a society just don't recognise and accept sex work as real work, even though it provides a service and functions exactly like any other industry. But the concept of unskilled labour, especially the implication that it's unnecessary or lesser than so-called skilled labour, is complete bullshit. I've worked jobs that are looked down upon and dismissed as unskilled and anyone could do them, and they were some of the hardest fucking jobs I've ever had. McDonald's especially was fucking brutal. Ours was working in a Wetherspoon's kitchen. Apart from being an insulting description of the essential, often back-breaking and emotionally draining work millions of people do, low-skilled labour has no clear definition. Often it suggests a kind of dispensability. Low-skilled work is work that anyone could do given a few hours training. Other definitions focus more on the lack of formal qualifications needed for the role. This, I should note, would put the Prime Minister in the same category as care workers, hairdressers and garbage collectors, but whatever way you choose to define it, we all have a sense of what is really meant by low-skilled work. It's a euphemism for low-valued work. Work that wouldn't impress at a certain kind of dinner party. Work that doesn't inspire envy. Work that is unglamorous. Work that cleans your office during the night so your desk's not sticky when you get in. Work that takes care of your sick parents so you don't have to. Work that looks after your children so you don't have to. Work that serves you coffee when you desperately need a moment of human interaction. Work that puts food on your table. Work that cleans up the street outside your house. Work that builds cities. Work without which economies would collapse. Sex work is work, and no different from any other kind of work under our patriarchal capitalist hell world. Certainly, it's no less a real job than any other profession, and a lot more of a job than owning property or inheriting a fortune, but usually anti-sex work people tend to ignore capitalists' lack of a real job, so I guess let's just gloss over that. I touched on this in my last Chud Film School video, but there are a lot of people, even some who call themselves feminists, who feel that they have the right to not only dictate what others do with their lives and bodies, but also claim that some women embracing and or using their sexuality for profit, or sharing themselves online, etc., is some kind of anti-feminist thing that reduces women down to nothing more than sex objects. And like, that might make sense when we're talking about big anime titties and the framing of women in media made primarily by and for men, but not to individual real-life women, for fuck's sake. Ironically, this is the kind of feminist who makes the rest of us feminists look bad by trying to argue that women choosing to be stay-at-home mums is anti-feminist, or liking certain sexual acts or dynamics is anti-feminist. Like, mate, come on, be serious. You're trying to argue for a movement that works for the liberation and freedom of women, especially women's sexuality, and you're going to stand there and without a hint of irony claim that it's the women taking control of their bodies and sexualities who make feminism look bad, not the puritanical white liberal feminists trying to enforce patriarchal norms on women, but from the opposite direction. Yeah, no, sorry, but fuck off with that. There is an interesting discussion to be had in situations in which men have power over the sex workers, and the ways in which, for example, porn is designed to appeal to men's idea of female sexuality and not like female sexuality from the perspective of women. But again, that's the system that needs to change, not the individual people, bottom-rung employees working within it, any more than people working on the ground within the construction industry were responsible for the Grenfell Tower disaster. The problem there is capitalism, because sexism sells. Sex workers are more susceptible to abuse and coercion than the general population due to, among a few other reasons, the very simple fact that sex work is illegal, so there are almost no legal repercussions for any illegal activity carried out against them. Stealing something from another criminal isn't generally considered a crime carrying much legal risk, because what are they going to do? Go to the police and say that you stole the TV they stole from someone else? Likewise, taking advantage of or screwing over a sex worker isn't seen as legally risky as doing it to anyone else, because often sex workers are afraid to go to the police or pursue legal action for a number of reasons, but mainly because the police are known to arrest sex workers who go to them for help, but also because the police are known to be abusive towards sex workers, because what? Who are they going to call if a police officer assaults them? The police? And this is without going into the issues around immigration and the fact that undocumented immigrants are often coerced or pressured into sex work because most other more official work is out of reach for them, and all the police have to do is ask for papers and oh look, the new American SS is out in force to deport them. If only they'd kept their mouths shut, they wouldn't have been in this situation, and so on and so forth. Once again, for the most part, the problem isn't sex work in specific, but the fact that it's illegal, the fucked up immigration system, and the prevalence of abusers in the police. Sex work, the argument often goes, ruins lives even when it's legal. Just look at Mia Khalifa. Oh boy, okay, let's look at Mia Khalifa, but before we do, let's establish a couple of things. 1. If you judge or shun someone because they have a job you don't like that harms and affects basically nobody, that's on you, not them. 2. If you don't respect an OnlyFans model but you do respect someone like a YouTuber, your priorities are fucked up and also you have a very confused idea of what a YouTuber does for work. 3. Overlooking workplace abuse because you are uncomfortable about sex or sex work is fucked up. And 4. What someone chooses to do with their body is their choice and theirs alone and should not be the business of anyone else but the people involved. This goes for LGBTQ+ people in open relationships and so on and so forth, but apparently we as a society seem to struggle to really apply the same principle to sex work because of the illogical and puritanical double standards and weirdness a lot of us seem to hold towards and around sex.
Mia Khalifa. Mia Khalifa.
The porn industry is a predatory one. It preys on young girls desperate for money, uses and abuses them, and is rife with abuse and misogyny. I don't want anyone to think that I believe the life of a sex worker is easy or that legalizing it would fix all the problems within it by any stretch, but a lot of the issues sex workers face as a result of their job is due to patriarchal and sex-negative views of sex most of society still cling to this day. When it comes to Mia Khalifa, the backlash she suffered when she was outed as a sex worker was such that it caused severe PTSD, and she is still to this day victimized by the porn industry. There is still an active website under her name which she says she doesn't own or profit from. She's still among the highest ranked and most viewed porn stars of all time, despite making just $12,000 in total from her time in the industry, and as a result of her 3-month period as a porn actress in 2015, she still struggles to find work half a decade later because no company wants to hire a porn star. Possibly most egregious of all though, her family disowned her, leaving her alone to fend for herself in a society that did not respect her because she had sex on camera 12 times half a decade ago. They disowned me when they found out. I felt completely alienated by not just the world, but my family and the people around me, especially after I quit, when I was still alone, even though I left, and I just realised some mistakes aren't forgivable. Mia Khalifa is a tragic figure because she was scouted at a vulnerable time in her life by abusive porn executives used to make probably billions, but certainly a lot more than the $12,000 she was paid, has no power over her own work, image or name being used in ways she doesn't endorse, and as a result of basically being victimized by people with power taking advantage of her vulnerability, coupled with the normalized prudish attitudes towards sex and the stigmatized nature of certain aspects of it, lost almost all opportunity to live an ordinary life. If her story tells us anything, it should be that more regulation of the industry needs to be imposed, and that simple legalization of sex work will not be enough to solve all the problems sex workers currently face if we don't also tackle societal attitudes towards society and sex work as well. Mia Khalifa's story only happened the way it did because we allow capitalism and stigma of sex work to dominate and take over the conversation in the way that they currently do, and yet SWERFs and anti-sex work advocates will claim that actually it's the fact that it's sex work that's to blame here. There's no systemic issues to deal with, everybody move along. Mia Khalifa's story is a sadly common one and can be very easily compared to the recent #MeToo movement in Hollywood, as well as every other abusive and exploitative workplace the world over. The problem is not sex work, it is both society's attitudes towards sex work and also an unwillingness or inability to accurately deal with the abuse, exploitation and power imbalance inherent to capitalism. Sex work is where misogyny and capitalism are most clearly intertwined, but much like every other misogynist, often anti-sex work people will simply blame the victim for their abuse. Nobody deserves to be abused because of their job, just as nobody deserves to be assaulted because of the way they dress, and yet SWERFs, who often advocate for the latter whilst rejecting the former, seem unable to see the hypocrisy there. Sex workers do not sell their bodies any more than any other working class person. If someone on OnlyFans sells their body to perverts on the internet, then I sell my body to the insurance company I work for. Anyone who says that sex work is easy money or getting paid to lie on their back clearly has no clue what is actually involved in a lot of sex work, but should also, by that logic, be explicitly anti-capitalist, since if you think that people shouldn't get paid for no work, then by definition you don't believe that capitalism is a meritocracy, and also you should be against the existence of both landlords and CEOs because unlike sex workers, they actually do get paid astronomical amounts of money to do barely any work, if any at all. In actual fact, a huge portion of sex work is the ability to act. Act like you're interested in a client, act like you're enjoying yourself, or act like you're a bubbly, happy person without an actual real life or thoughts, dreams, or aspirations to worry about. Likewise, if you believe that sex work is anti-feminist or inherently misogynistic, then I would invite you to re-examine your views and consider how consistent they really are, because I don't know about you, but I don't think it really makes sense to, on the one hand, complain about exploitation of women's bodies and proselytize about bodily autonomy, which is completely valid and important by the way, but then also turn around and prevent women using their bodies in ways you don't like, in the same way that we as feminists must acknowledge that if you slut-shame women for dressing provocatively, you also can't shame Muslim women wearing traditional headscarves, because in both cases you're trying to liberate women by controlling what they do with their bodies and what clothes they should wear. Sex work can be, and in many cases is, dangerous, but a lot of the time people fail to really understand that the reason it's dangerous is because it's illegal and therefore not really covered by workers' rights or workplace safety laws, patriarchy normalizing and creating sexist and abusive work environments, and also of course capitalism incentivizing exploitation above safety. Likewise, the reason that people claim that sex work ruins lives is not due to the fact that sex work in and of itself is inherently exploitative or life-ruining, but because of both the way we as a society look down upon and view sex, and also the way we have such little empathy for those people in the industry. There are a lot of issues within the sex industry, but they mostly derive from the following factors. 1. The fact that most of it is at least partially illegal. 2. Societal attitudes towards sex and sex workers. And 3. You guessed it, capitalism and the exploitation inherent therein. Once we solve, or at least mitigate, these 3 things, then we can at least have a decent shot at making the sex industry safer and more ethical, because that's what SWERFs want, right? I mean, it's not all just thinly veiled puritanism and classism with a side helping of wanting to control women's bodies whilst retaining the imagined moral high ground, right? Nah, that would be ridiculous.
This house, there's some whores in this house, there's some whores in this house, there's some whores in this house.
I said certified free, 7 days a week.
Hello everyone, thanks so much for watching. Before we go on to the credits proper, I just wanted to thank Kezzbox. It was an excellent Twitch streamer, former sex worker, and excellent NB, who helped fact check and was the script editor for this video. Usually I don't have a script editor, it's all me, but on this occasion, because I'm not 100% familiar with a lot of sex work issues and sex work experiences, I thought that I would ask someone who was more thoroughly knowledgeable in this area and who has experience and was able to point out where I was wrong, come work on it. It's probably not something I could do on a regular basis, because obviously I don't actually get paid much, if at all, from making these videos, but I thought it was important, and I think this video is important to be able to send to people, especially SWERFs, who try to invalidate and make life more dangerous for sex workers. So I thought on this occasion it would make sense to hire a script editor. Anyway, thanks so much for watching everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it's useful. I hope it was informative if you, like me, weren't 100% clear on some aspects of the sex industry. And I would thoroughly recommend that you go and check out Kezzbox on Twitch, and they've recently started up a YouTube account as well, I believe. So I'll link those in the pinned comment and in the description as well. Thanks again to Kezzbox for all the help. And now let's get into the credits. So, the names you see on screen right now are the names of my patrons who give me money each month, which allows me to buy food, which, considering that as of 2 days ago, as of recording, I've been informed by my employer that I'm probably going to be made redundant due to the COVID-19 situation. It's a whole thing. I'm gonna try and fight back against it, but either way, I very much appreciate my patrons right now. If you want to join them, you can click on the link on screen or in the description and donate $1 or more. If you donate $5 or more, you do actually get extra benefits. So you get these video essays usually a day or so early before they go up on YouTube, and you also get the option of me reading out your username at the end of every video over the credits. And if you want to make me say a silly thing, you can just change your username to something silly, and I will be contractually obliged to say it. So today I especially want to thank The Bulk, Polite Pigeon, The General Line, Good Poon Hates Cops, That's Solid Poon Then, Bryden Beck, Elise Jade, Calliope, Nanza Kambe, Chris Ragnacci, Teodor Pekelarov, Pixels Green, Emily. Next we have Ryan, Brian, it's Brian, Susie M, Thomas McCallum and Tom Newport. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.